Lone Rider here, and I want to talk a little bit about HEMA, historical swordsmanship. Uh, there was a video that was put up a while ago by Scalagrim, who has a long established YouTube channel where he talks about things, including historical swords and swordsmanship. And it was in response to a comment that was left on one of his videos. He showed in his video a bunch of people sparring at a sword fighting club with proper protective gear and all of that, and blunted swords. And people posted several responses to this. One of the most telling responses was a person who posted that this activity should be illegal because you're teaching people how to use swords, and therefore you're teaching people how to hurt people. And the poster actually, the way he said it was that he didn't mind that people own swords. He didn't want to ban swords. He just wanted to ban practice with swords. So it's okay to own one in his mind as long as you don't know how to use it. Apparently, once you know how to use it, then it becomes dangerous. That would be like saying it's okay to own guns, but nobody should ever attend a gun safety course. If you ask me, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. Um, yes, people on their own could responsibly, theoretically, train with swords in their backyards or meet at a gym or something and do it, just a handful of people on their own without a proper instructor or without the sword manuals. But the HEMA clubs that exist really do serve a purpose. If you imagine what would happen if you had a bunch of people who just got together with these things and started wailing on each other without proper instruction, even if they had protective gear, you'd still find a lot of people getting hurt really quick. And what they would be learning wouldn't be historical European martial arts or HEMA, because they wouldn't be learning any actual techniques. They would just be wailing on each other with the swords. Um, I don't see like a benefit to that, and most people wouldn't. But this guy elaborated in his post. He said the reason he's concerned with people learning swordsmanship, and this is where it gets really weird. And I have to say, um, uh, to me, I don't practice historical swordsmanship because I'm some kind of, you know, like I believe there's going to be an apocalypse, so I want to train myself to use a sword to kill zombies or aliens or werewolves or something. No, I just think it's fun. I'm interested in history. It's a bit of exercise, and I've always thought swords were really cool. So when I discovered this and I realized that there are organized sword clubs where you can safely learn how to use swords in the historical way, I was like, yeah, that's awesome. Let me learn how to do that. Um, so to me, as somebody who's approaching this as a modern activity, not as somebody who believes that I'm going to ever have to use this in combat or anything like that, but somebody who just does it because it's fun and it's exercise, and I'm learning about history and about one of the most iconic weapons of history. And I'm also helping in a small way, as we all are who do this, to sort of bring back that history, bring it to life. It's one thing to read about it in a history book or watch something on the History Channel. It's another thing when you can hold it in your hands. And yeah, that's pretty cool. So, you know, the idea that somebody would be worried that people are learning historical swordsmanship because you're afraid they're going to use swords as like weapons of crime or something. I mean, when could you imagine somebody going into a liquor store with a sword and being like, "Give me all your money"? I don't see that happening. I mean, swords haven't been used in combat in on the battlefield since I guess World War I, really, and they haven't been worn as sidearms in civilian life for even further back than that. So nobody's going to start walking around with swords again. And I don't understand why frankly, any sane person would worry about that. I mean, if nothing else, a sword is pretty big and cumbersome. And, even if you have a long coat, somebody's going to see that you're carrying a sword and call the police, unless there's a Ren fair in town or something. Uh, It's not a normal thing to see on the street. Somebody would notice it's out of place. There's this guy walking around with a medieval sword. Call 911. You'd probably get stopped before you ever got around to committing a robbery or a street crime or whatever. So I don't understand why any sane person would worry that because somebody is a member of a sword fighting club and they're learning historical swordsmanship techniques, that's teaching people how to hurt folks out in the street. I don't foresee, even in the most bizarre world future you could imagine, and it would have to be some kind of imaginary fantasy setting like Mad Max or something, but I don't see this becoming a weapon of crime on any kind of a scale. Think about it, people. So I got to wonder, when I first saw this posting, my first thought was this is a joke. Somebody just posted this, it's a troll or whatever. Somebody just posted this to get a rise out of people or to see what their response would be, or because it was funny. Let me write something that's so over the top that it's absurd and post it. But Skallagrim took it serious enough to do a debunking video. And then I thought about it and I said, maybe I should say something. Because we know there are people out there who want to ban things that they don't like. Case in point, see all the gun control hysteria that's been going on since the latest tragic mass shooting in Florida. You can't ignore that kind of attitude exists. There are people out there who see something they don't like or don't understand, and it should be illegal. And so, you can laugh and snicker and say, what a wacko. Does he really think people are going to start walking around with swords on the street? I don't know. But his attitude is certainly one that has found political purchase on other issues where other things have been targeted for being banned. So I think we can laugh and snicker and say, what a wackadoodle. But we should also remember that kind of attitude has led to pushes for legislation in the past. So you have to take the time to say, that's wrong. And it's ironic because Skallagrim's debunking video focused on the idea that people practicing the martial arts, whether it's karate or hapkido or some form of fencing, either Olympic fencing, sport fencing, or historical fencing of some kind, longsword, saber, whatever, doesn't make people violent. And he focused on that and on various studies and about aggression and do people become violent because they learn martial arts, etc. And he did a very good job of addressing that succinctly. The problem is that, no offense to Skallagrim here, but the problem is that that's not really what the commentator was talking about. He wasn't saying that because people practice historical swordsmanship, they're going to become violent. What he was saying is because people are practicing historical swordsmanship, they'll be able to effectively use a sword as a weapon if that ever becomes a thing. And of course, any sane person would say, well, of course that's not going to become a thing. I mean, think about it. The poster indicated why he thought it would become a thing. As absurd as this sounds, this is what he wrote. He wrote that people like himself want to ban guns. If guns are banned in the future, hypothetically, melee weapons like clubs and swords and things may come back into fashion for a street crime as a result of his idea of gun prohibition being implemented. And therefore, we shouldn't have people learning how to use swords now, because sometime in the future, if he gets his way and guns are banned, then people might resort to things like swords or similar edged weapons, like, let's say, machetes. And he doesn't want them to be equipped with the knowledge to use them if they have to, because he banned guns, or people like him banned guns. Now, this is a fantasy setting. Even in countries with strict gun control, there's still violent crime, and most people aren't using swords, knives, clubs, and sometimes guns, because of course, even when there's strict gun control, people still buy stolen guns. Guns can get smuggled in. Guns can be stolen from people who are still allowed to have them. The famous Kate Steinle shooting in California, tragic incident, a young woman shot dead. Um, the guy who shot her was carrying a gun that was, if you trace it back, stolen from a federal agent's car. A Bureau of Land Management agent had this pistol in his car. It was stolen from the car. It found its way into the hands of this individual who shot this young woman, and she died. And that shooting would still have occurred, and that young woman would still be dead, even if we had total prohibition on private firearm ownership in this country. Why? Because it wasn't a private American citizen who had the gun. The gun didn't come from somebody's, it wasn't a private citizen who had his own gun and shot her. It wasn't somebody using a gun stolen from a private citizen. It wasn't somebody using a gun that was, bought maybe in another state where the laws are less strict and brought in. It was a gun that was stolen from a federal agent. So, hopefully most federal agents do a better job of securing their weapons. But the point with this incident is that even if you had a total prohibition on private firearm ownership in America, that shooting would still have occurred and that woman would still be dead, which is tragic. But the point is that what it says for the idea of total firearm prohibition, even if you're somebody who believes in that sort of thing, it still wouldn't prevent all gun crime. So the idea that you could create a society where there'd be absolutely no firearms of any kind in private hands, even improvised ones or ones stolen from, government officials or police or whatever, that's never going to happen. And even if they did manage to somehow get rid of all the guns, there's other weapons besides for swords. People would use knives, and in the UK there's a lot of knife crime, for example. Although they still have gun shootings as well. Obviously not as many because guns aren't as prevalent, but guns were never really as prevalent as in the U.S. and England. So I'm not sure how much of that is gun related, as far as the gun control there, and how much of that is just a cultural and a demographic thing. But be that as it may, the point is some people still do own guns, and there is still crime. And even if you're just looking at, well, could there be crime without private firearm ownership involving guns? Yeah. A bent quartermaster sells a gun at an army base. Somebody steals a gun from a federal agent's car, etc. So I don't think that even in this fantasy scenario, and it is a fantasy scenario because, even countries with strict gun control still have crime and still have some gun crime. I don't think people would be carrying swords in public. It's just, think about it, people. But I guess what's ironic for me is that it would be a fantasy scenario of his own creation. This person is postulating that we should ban an athletic activity like swordsmanship, like fencing, because he foresees a hypothetical future where his people of his mindset get their way and guns are banned, and therefore, well, if guns are banned, people might start using other things to kill themselves. So we should ban sword fighting right now, ban sword practice right now, just in case this hypothetical fantasy future with no guns comes to pass. I'm trying to be as polite as I can here, but my reaction has to be, are you out of your fracking mind? That's like saying we should ban archery, because if we ban guns, what if people start using bows again to shoot each other? Really, I don't understand this kind of mentality. I don't even understand the mentality of wanting to ban guns. But then to say, okay, so we should ban sword practice. And what's interesting is he says, he doesn't say we should ban swords. He's okay with people owning swords. He just doesn't want them to be able to practice the proper techniques on how to use them. Presumably because a sword requires a lot more skill to use than just pointing a gun and shooting it. Now, the first time I went to a shooting range, believe me, I did pretty decent with a pistol, but I have to say it is a lot harder. You can't just point and shoot. You have to kind of know what you're doing. You have to have the right grip on it. You have to have, decent hand-eye coordination, etc. That said, a sword, you're probably more likely to injure yourself with an overswing or some other thing um, than you would be with a firearm, as long as you're not pointing it, let's say, down at your own feet, or you get a ricochet that comes back at you. So I could see the argument that, well, um, to learn how to use it in a way that avoids hurting yourself, being as dangerous to yourself as the other person, um, it's helpful to have practice with swords and know the proper techniques. That's absolutely true. But we're not studying those techniques because we want to go out and rob liquor stores with our swords. Okay, this is an athletic pursuit. This is a historical pursuit. This is no different than any other combat-based or martial arts activity. Nobody argues that we should outlaw Taekwondo because if in some hypothetical future where all guns are gone, people might start, uh, side kicking each other to death. Um, I don't understand that kind of mentality. Um, but it is interesting that he doesn't have a problem with people owning swords. He just doesn't want them to know how to use them. And I guess just like I have to say, well, how would you ever really completely get rid of guns? You can't. I mean, even if private citizens were forbidden completely from owning them, you could smuggle them in. We don't do a great job of keeping out drugs or people. How are we going to keep out guns, which are smaller, guns smaller than a human being? And of course, people could make crude firearms. And then you have, guns could be stolen from those who are still allowed to have them, like government, police, and officials. Um, by the same token, how would you stop somebody from learning how to use a sword? I guess you could censor and suppress all historical swordsmanship manuals and all writing on the subject. That wouldn't go over well with the First Amendment here in America. You might be able to accomplish that in other countries where they don't have a legal protection of their free speech rights, a written guarantee the way we do with our Bill of Rights. But even in countries that don't necessarily have a written Bill of Rights with a written freedom of speech and guaranteed, many countries still have a tradition of freedom of expression. They might not have a guarantee the way we do, but the people in those countries would still object to being censored in that way. And with the internet being what it is, and with communications all over the world electronically being what it is, how would you keep that information from coming to people? You would have to have a worldwide agreement on censorship. You couldn't just say let's censor sword fighting in America because some guy in Venezuela or Russia or England or Timbuktu could post, Lichtenauer or something online, and we could all read about how to fight with swords. You'd have to have, you'd have to have some kind of a restriction on the information. It's not just to say you could ban sword clubs. Okay, that's great. Nobody's going to have an official sword club, so people will just meet, like unofficially, like in somebody's, garage or something, right? I mean, it might make it a little more difficult, but and how much resources are you going to expend on making this illegal? Considering sword crime is literally not a thing. Are you going to, all those police officers who could be investigating the next Nicholas Cruz before he does a tragic school shooting, are you going to have them raiding underground sword fencing clubs now? Is that how you're going to spend your finite police resources? And even if you actually said, okay, we're going to ban swords, we're not just going to ban knowledge of swordsmanship, which is what he's saying. But even if you said we're actually going to ban swords, I have here a crude wooden practice messer. Now, this isn't really useful as a weapon beyond like a stick, but if somebody wants to practice messer techniques, you could just make something like this and spar with these. Wooden wasters have been used for years before they had, before blunt sparring swords were as accessible. People used wooden swords. Single stick was essentially a wooden training analog for saber and backsword. So, this guy is saying, well, I just want to ban practice of swordsmanship, not actual ownership of swords. It's kind of impossible to do that because you'd have to restrict the flow of information. How are you going to do that? There's a lot of people. The HEMA community is pretty large all over the world. It's not as mainstream as, let's say, modern sport fencing, but it's a lot larger than it was years ago, and it's growing. All of those people who have this knowledge, how are you going to keep them from sharing it with other people? Okay, you could censor the internet, maybe, but people could still pass out, printed pamphlets. People could still meet and talk to each other. How are you going to prevent that? And even if you went so far as to say, let's ban actual swords and sword reproductions and not allow them to be sold, again, people could still make their own, training analogs. In fact, the training analogs don't necessarily have to be made out of wood. You could have somebody make something like this. Now, this is made out of mild steel, so there's no flex in the blade. There's no spring in the blade. This is a reproduction I made of a gladius years and years ago, just to have something to practice swinging with. It's blunt. There's no edge. But, somebody could easily make a metal practice sword. So I guess I'm trying to say, how would you stop people from making and practicing swordsmanship? You can't. It's the same problem you run into with trying to restrict firearms or any other type of thing. We outlawed alcohol at one point in America, and what happened? A proliferation of smugglers and bathtub gin. So I don't understand where this guy's coming from. I guess it's that authoritarian mindset where I don't like it, so it should be illegal. And the irony again is that his proposal was to restrict fencing clubs and the practice of swordsmanship because he foresees a hypothetical future where people like him get their way and guns are banned. You know what? My solution to that is, if that's what you're really afraid of, then just don't ban guns and everybody's fine. The people who practice the shooting sports with firearms don't get infringed on. You don't get your hypothetical fantasy future with a sword crime wave. And I don't get some doofus telling me that I can't go to my sword fighting club on Sunday and practice longsword techniques. Everybody wins. Isn't it amazing? That's what happens when you just leave people free to do what they want. As long as they're not hurting anybody and they're not doing anything wrong, everybody wins when you respect everybody else and their rights and their ability to just live their life as they see fit. Isn't it interesting when you take a step back and you say, hey, if I just don't meddle with my fellow human beings, if I just don't try to be a petty little dictator, everybody comes out ahead. It's amazing how that works. But I did want to share this. It's a bit longer than I wanted to go on about this. But when I saw this post on Scalagrim's website, somebody reacting to a simple sparring bout at a sword fighting club, at a gymnasium. And their response is to say, this is awful. You're teaching people how to use swords as weapons. It should be illegal. I'm sitting there and I'm like, are you for real? Like, are you hepped up on goofballs? That it's interesting, especially in light of the gun control hysteria that's come out in recent weeks, since the latest mass shooting, because, a lot of the gun control advocates are trying to, for years they've been trying to present themselves as reasonable. And you have somebody like this, and it really kind of shows you where that mentality does lead if you take it to its logical conclusion. Well, I want to ban guns, but hey, if you ban guns, then people might use other things, so we should ban those too, or the practice of them. I mean, what next? Are you going to ban, pieces of wood? I mean, not for nothing, but somebody could just take a stick and use that as a weapon. Are you going to ban, lumber? At what point does this pass from, okay, it sounds like maybe some of the proposals aren't so bad, to total wacko breakdown? And the idea that somebody would even worry that, folks are going to start using swords again and carrying them in the street, like, what the hell's wrong with you, fool? Seriously. Now, it may just be this guy. He may just be But, I have to wonder, as somebody who, when I read something, I think about what I have read. And, like I said, Scalagrim took this serious enough to do a rebuttal video about the idea that practicing martial arts makes people violent. I would argue that since actually what this guy was talking about wasn't that it makes people violent, but simply that it equips them with the skills to use a sword as a weapon potentially, that's what should be addressed. Why does he think that people would be using swords as weapons? Well, because gun control. It's interesting to note that his proposal for gun control would be the very impetus for the problem that he then says should be solved by preemptively banning practice of fencing. And, again, the gun control advocates at times have tried to make themselves sound reasonable. A lot of times there's just a lot of screeching and name calling and, if you don't agree with me, you don't care that people have been shot in crimes. That's what a lot of it's deteriorated to nowadays. However, when you get a gun control advocate up there that does sort of sound reasonable, and you start sort of thinking maybe he has a point. Think about this. Think about that there are people in the gun control camp who follow their line of reasoning to its logical conclusion, which is that if you ban guns, you'd have to ban everything else, including the practice of long swords. Yeah. All of a sudden, that attitude of let's ban something because it might be misused doesn't sound so reasonable anymore, does it? I don't know about you, but I'm going to be going to my sword fighting meet on Sunday, and I'm going to be having a lot more fun than that spoil sport will be. And that's the way it should be. To each their own. One rider out.